Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. If you're here, then you can go ahead and pat yourself on the back because this is my very first video, and if you somehow found it, I'm really impressed. But as you can tell by the title, I'm going to be discussing Gon from Hunter x Hunter and why I think he was not a monster. As you've probably seen from various videos that are already on YouTube, it's actually a really popular opinion for people to think that Gon was some sort of monster, and I think a lot of this was solidified by the Chimera Ant arc and his erratic behavior during that time. And while I understand where a lot of people are coming from when they make this judgment, I really wanted to offer a counter argument because I don't think he was a monster, and I'll get into it by covering three big factors. So number one, Gon's view on his body. Number two, Gon's view on his friends and their well-being. And number three, a bit of commentary on humanity and what makes a person humane. So let's get into it. So number one, a huge argument that people have to justify why they think that Gon is a monster is the lack of respect that he has for his body, the very little regard that he has towards his own well-being. And I really want to place the emphasis on his own because I think that there's a stark contrast between how Gon views his well-being versus his friend's well-being, and it's shown in various scenes. He's even said it overtly to Killua, like, I'm the one who acts reckless and risks my life. You're just supposed to be the one who stops me, but like, don't go and try and sacrifice yourself. And I remember Killua saying that Gon was really selfish, and it's funny because looking back at that scene, it was kind of foreshadowing the dynamic between the two and how Gon could be very selfish when it comes to those type of things, because he understands the value of other people's life as it pertains to him, but he doesn't understand the value of his life as it relates to his friends and how his friends view the value of his life. So anyway, number one, I want to just say Gon has always placed little importance on his physical well-being as long as he feels like it brings him closer to his personal goals. So we see this in the Hunter exam arc when he's getting beat up by Hanzo and how he doesn't tap out, and we see this when he's getting beat up by Canary when he's on his way to try and save Killua and he doesn't tap out. We see this in Heaven's Arena arc when he is facing the spinner guy. So during the first fight, we see that Gon loses against the spinner guy, and then we later find in the rematch that he won. But during the first time he fought him, he was at a huge disadvantage. He was not familiar with Nen, and I remember Master Wing was watching this fight from the stands or from outside the arena, and he was saying something along the lines that, is this kid training during a match? He was very caught off guard and a bit disturbed. He was also surprised that Gon already knew how to use one version of Nen without having having taught him about it, which I thought was really indicative of how Gon would learn and become stronger in the future. But that's another example of how Gon pretty much uses his body as like a bartering chip, as leverage when it comes to getting stronger or pursuing a goal that he finds to be a lot more significant than temporary pain. At least that's probably how he views it. So we also see this in the Phantom Troop arc when Gon asks Kurapika to pierce him with the Sword of Truth, just so that he holds him accountable in case he reveals information about him without meaning to, that, he could take his life. And I think that's really indicative on how much emphasis Gon places on loyalty and truth, and also in his friends. And I'm going to get into that in the second point, but I think that was a huge scene for me. I was just really taken aback. Like, this guy is really willing to put his own dreams and goals on the back burner and risk his life as long as it means that he stays true to his friends. But in the Greed Island arc, we see him, this is a huge scene where he sacrifices his arm in his fight against the bomber guy. I think his name was Genthro, and that scene was pretty crazy, and I understand why a lot of people use that scene when they're trying to explain why Gon is a monster and why. I don't think it makes him a monster. I think he definitely is unhinged, and it was a disturbing scene. I was just like, I don't understand why this kid didn't go with the plan. He could have saved his arm, he could have took down this bomber guy, and I think in addition to showing to me that he was pretty unhinged, it also displayed how much more importance he places on his goals than his physical well-being. He just sees his body as a bartering chip, as leverage. And granted, Gon knew that he could heal his arm. I think it's still pretty crazy that he literally bore through that pain just to try out a strategy that didn't have any guarantees, which I think was very, very crazy. And of course, the most popular scene is during the Chimera Ant arc when he's fighting Pito, and he essentially sacrifices his life force and his ability to use Nen and essentially his life in order to avenge Kite. And that's a huge scene that people use to explain why Gon is a monster. And I think that had that scene not been a thing, that this would have been more controversial, but I think this scene kind of sealed the deal for a lot of people. And again, I understand why, but I also want to just point out that during the Chimera Ant arc, I think immediately after Kite is pretty much killed and they run away, well, Killua knocks out Gon and runs away with him in order to assure their safety. I think from that very point, Gon actually knows internally that Kite is gone, and he goes through a grieving process. And if you kind of take a look at the various stages Gon goes through emotionally, you can kind of see that he's grieving, and the only person who knows that he's grieving is Killua. And while in some cases that's kind of like cool and it shows the depth of their friendship, it's also kind of tragic, and it kind of plays into the way a lot of people judge Gon. I think that a lot of people hold him to a different standard than Killua, because I think if the roles were switched, I think people would be incredibly empathetic if Killua was going through the same thing Gon was going through. But because Killua was already introduced as a cutthroat kid, people are a lot more empathetic towards him when he evolves to be a lot more empathetic. But when Gon starts off as an empathetic kid and he evolves to be less empathetic, people are just they're not tolerant of it. They're very intolerant. So I know some of you will probably be asking, well, okay, Gon places very little value on his life. How does that not make him a monster? Well, if you look at a lot of the examples that I showed or I talked about, a lot of them were on behalf of other people, and only some of them were for his own gain. So I think when it comes to his friends, Gon places a lot of emphasis on the value of their well-being and is willing to literally leverage his life to help them. But when it comes to his own self, he's willing to put his own goals to the side if it means helping out a friend. And that actually brings me to my second point, which is that Gon has always put his safety on the line when it comes to helping his friends. And I also wanted to just highlight that I found a lot of comments saying that Gon was far too invested or emotionally invested in Kite for, as little time as he known him. And I saw some other people who responded to this and said, well, Hunter x Hunter, the 2011 version, didn't really do a good job of establishing a rapport with Kite because, number one, not only was he in the show for like 5-6 episodes, but they also didn't start off the show with Kite, which is how the novel started off, and that's how the older version of Hunter x Hunter started off. So it didn't allow the audience to establish a rapport with Kite. So I think that's a huge part in it, but I also think that I find it to be very bizarre that people hold this against Gon, because Gon has always established very quick friendships and has always invested himself emotionally in people very quickly. And I think that it's interesting that people think that Gon is far too invested in Kite, someone that he considered a friend and someone who essentially played a huge role on him even wanting to be a hunter to begin with, and who died. But when Gon becomes best friends with Killua after knowing him for a short amount of time and literally goes to his mansion to try and save him from his family, people are like, best friends forever, that's squad goals. I think that's a bit hypocritical. But anyway, just to highlight some examples of how much value Gon places on his friends, let's start off from the Hunter exam arc. So in the very first episode, I believe it's the first, if not the second, we see when Gon literally tries to save a sailor from being flung off board the ship after meeting him for a few minutes, like no more than 10 minutes. Gon was already diving off the ship, full body off the ship, to save the sailor and risking his life for him after knowing him for a few minutes, which is another example from the very first episode of how Gon establishes connections and friendships very quickly. If we want to have a bonus, there's a scene where Gon is holding Leorio's suitcase during the running part of the exam, and how Gon, during the running part of the exam, literally stops and waits for Leorio while Killua continues running and Kurapika continues to run. Gon stays back and waits for Leorio to catch his breath, get motivated, and start running again. And in order to help out Leorio, he takes his suitcase, which again is another example of how much Gon cares for his friends. Another example is coming to Leorio and Kurapika's aid when they fought against Hisoka the first time. Again, abandoning the exam and potentially risking the potential of passing, his potential to pass, in order to help out his friends. Getting bitten by snakes to save Leorio and help him pass the exam. Not caving into the pressure of the test that required that only 3 people go through to the final round, but instead breaking the walls to help everyone pass. Another example, threatening and breaking Illumi's arm on behalf of Killua after only knowing him for a short amount of time. And doing it only because Illumi essentially, he hurt Killua's feelings, and Gon was really livid. And again, to re-emphasize the point I already brought up, but going to Killua's family mansion to rescue him despite getting beat up by Canary, again, after only knowing him for a very short amount of time. So that's only from the Hunter exam arc. There's like various examples afterwards. If we want to go into the Heaven's Arena arc, we see how Gon gets extremely pissed off at the Dreidel guy for essentially threatening, what's his name, Zushi, the Osu kid. After threatening him, he gets really pissed off, and he only knew Zushi for like an episode. So to move on to the Phantom Troop arc, insisting on being able to help Kurapika with his plans to take down the Phantom Troop, allowing himself to get recaptured by the Phantom Troop in order to help Kurapika, his fast friendship with the Treasure Inspector and his hesitance at charging him. Another bonus is telling Killua that he was not allowed to sacrifice his life or act reckless because that was his job. And that was the Phantom Troop arc. I'm sure I'm missing examples from that arc. But to move on to finally the Chimera Ant arc, we see his quick friendship with Kite, him immediately changing his plans from going to go fight Pito to fight Yuppie instead on behalf of Knuckle. So this is a scene that I think that a lot of people overlook when they're making arguments against Gon and how he's a monster. A lot of them use the way he spoke to Killua during the Chimera Ant arc in episode 116, the lack of empathy he had for Pito trying to heal Komogi, and his lack of empathy for Pito in general. People use that against him when trying to argue that he's a monster. And let me tell you something, Pito is literally one of my least favorite characters. I honestly feel like a lot of people hold that against him because a lot of people actually like Pito, and I'm gonna release a video on Pito. It'll probably be my second video about how he or she, they're gender neutral, I guess, is truly the real monster. I think a lot of people overlook some of the disturbing characteristics about Pito and try and justify it by saying, oh, well, they're a Chimera Ant. But when you compare Pito to other Chimera Ants, they're actually along the spectrum of being a lot more cruel and effed up than all the other ants. But that'll be a conversation for another video. But I think a lot of people overlook the fact that he was willing to put aside his plans to go after Pito and instead go after Yuppie after Killua's grandfather dropped his dragon dive onto the mansion. We see how he changes direction and goes straight for Yuppie way before any of Knuckles' comrades does it. And I think that's a huge example of his kind nature. Even in the midst of grief and anger, he's still willing to put his friends' livelihood and well-being above his own plans. And that's a theme that is very consistent and weaves throughout the entire story of Hunter x Hunter. Another bonus is that, and this is not so much about Gon, but I think again it points to the fact that Killua becomes more like Gon as the story progresses, and Gon becomes a lot more like Killua. So we see this when Killua literally does the same thing Gon did with Knuckle, but with the octopus guy. He changes direction in his pursuit of Pito to go and check on the octopus guy and make sure that he's okay. We also see how fast the friendship Killua had with the octopus guy. Even after he essentially placed him in a life-threatening situation, you see how Killua creates a very fast friendship with him. And he's also the same way with the chameleon guy. I think his name is oh my gosh, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Meleron? Sorry y'all, I just butchered his name. But again, we see Killua become a lot more like Gon. And even when it comes to the whole Pito situation, I often question whether or not the old Killua in the very beginning of the arc would have chosen the same stance. I feel like Killua from the very beginning of Hunter x Hunter would have agreed with Gon killing Pito there and then, because in the grand scheme of things, yes, Komogi would have died, which is unfortunate and that's messed up. But ultimately, I feel like the old Killua, like the older version of him, would have saw that as being the more logical stance anyway, because it's either Komogi's life or the life of like a ton of people, and this is the one chance to take down Pito. I don't think Killua from the beginning of the story would have been like, no, Gon, like spare her and allow her to heal her because we have to go heal Kite. Like, I think that's really interesting. Another example of how Killua becomes more like Gon is like he really places And this might be very unique to Gon. I don't know if this is like an everybody thing, but he really, throughout the Chimera Ant arc, we see how Killua, he hides certain things from Gon, but it's only for his own benefit. Like, he literally almost dies in order to allow Gon to have some sort of peace of mind. And I found that to be a very Gon thing to do. And I don't know how Gon would have reacted had he known how much Killua really did behind his back. I think that it would have really broke his heart. But anyway, moving on. Another bonus is Gon taking Palm out on a date. That's another example of just, I thought it was a cute example to throw in on how he can just be really, really kind. And I mentioned all these examples just to remind people of how Gon really is at his very core a really kind kid. He just doesn't place a lot of restraints on himself. He actually imposes the responsibility of establishing boundaries onto his friend Killua, which I think is still very selfish and it is very worthy of criticism, but I don't think, again, that makes him a monster. So that brings me to my last point and a bit of commentary on what makes a person humane. So the question is, does Gon's action make him less humane? A lot of people argue that it does. A lot of people say that you'll find in comment sections that it's crazy how Gon becomes more of a monster and the Chimera Ants become more humane. And while I understand the message people are trying to get across, it kind of makes me cringe when people say it. Mainly because, number one, the Chimera Ants that people are referencing to are still partially human. I think that people often disregard that aspect of things, so they do have human nature. In addition to having animal nature, they have a human nature side, and there's various scenes throughout the Chimera Ant arc where you see the ants literally recall their human lives, their human past, the way they were previously murdered, what they like to do, what they stood for, their values. And we see that in their interactions with each other and their interactions with other humans. And that's why I feel like Pito was really, her human nature and her animal nature really combined made her a really cruel individual, and I think a lot of people overlook it. But again, that's going to be discussed in another video. But anyway, I don't think Gon lost his humanity, as a lot of people say, because he killed Pito and, you know, essentially sacrificed his life. I thought it was very tragic that this kid was willing to literally sacrifice his life because he was grieving the loss of his friend. He was really feeling guilty for the death of Kite because he was in denial. He was grieving the whole entire time, and it's just really sad to look back on. And I also feel like Togashi, when in the scene where Netero is fighting Meruem, he made a very clear stance on human nature, and he made a very clear stance on what it means to be human and what humanity entails. And so, and I argue that in his statement about humanity, it also included Gon. So that's why I feel like when people say he's a monster, I think you actually give human beings way too much credit. If you look back on the fight where Netero is fighting Meruem, we actually see there's a point where Netero says, "You know nothing of the bottomless malice within the human heart," to Meruem, because, you know, Meruem was trying to negotiate with Netero about, hey, I see that some of you guys are good, so I'm willing to spare some of your lives. I'm willing to spare the lives of human beings that I find worthy. And it really displayed that Meruem knew nothing about human beings. Meruem only understood human beings as he was about to die. And that's because he understood what love was. But he never understood that human beings are willing to literally die for a greater purpose, literally sacrifice their lives for something that they perceive to be bigger than them. That he never even fathomed the idea that Netero would have a bomb in his heart and would be willing to sacrifice his life just to bring him down. That's not something that self-sacrifice is not something that I don't think Meruem was familiar with, and I don't think it's normal in other living organisms. And you can let me know if I'm wrong, and that's totally fine, but that's truly what I think. I think that even we see that, and this is a whole nother topic, and maybe I'll cover it in another video about Meruem and his short-sightedness when it came to human beings, because when he's playing against Komogi, and Komogi, he threatens Komogi's life and says, if you don't take this game seriously, and if you lose on purpose, I'm going to kill you. And Komogi's like, no, I've been risking my life in this game from the very beginning. I'm willing to die over this game. And it really startled him. And it caught him off guard because, again, he doesn't really understand human beings and their self-sacrificial, their willingness to be self-sacrificial when it comes down to things that they perceive to be bigger than them. And I think when Togashi wrote the line for Netero to say, you know nothing of the bottomless malice within the human heart, and he displayed you know, various examples in history where humans have literally dropped bombs on other countries. Like, human beings, we literally wage war over natural resources, kill each other over life insurance, enslave each other for free labor, and the list goes on. So the fact that Merriam thought that human beings were just going to be okay with being subjugated by a bunch of ants, it's just like, it was not going to happen. If Netero didn't kill him there and then another human being would have. And it segues perfectly to Gon, because he had that scene set up right before Gon fought with Pito, and we see how Gon has the willingness to be self-sacrificial as long as it means he gets to avenge Kite's death, and something that he's felt incredibly guilty over. And ultimately, I think that Gon's decision to, you know, sacrifice his life to avenge Kite just to take down Pito, again, it's not something that that made me look at him as a monster. I thought it was tragic. I thought it was really sad. And if anything, it made him incredibly humane. I think when people call him a monster, again, I think they give human beings way too much credit. Anyway, if you made it this far, I really appreciate you. In my next video, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be discussing Pito and why I think she was far more twisted a character than most people think. I'm also going to be discussing Gon's moral compass and whether or not his hypocrisy, you know, and I guess hypocrisy is an interesting term. Again, whether or not his hypocrisy reveals more about his naive worldview or his self-righteousness. Anyway, if you're interested in watching those videos, be sure to share, like, and subscribe. Until then, I'm signing out. Thank you.